June, 1945. The island of Okinawa is a jagged landscape of pulverized limestone and weeping vegetation, a place where the air itself seems composed of equal parts tropical humidity and the acrid metallic sting of high explosives. In the deep, subterranean gloom of a limestone cave near the southern cliffs, the atmosphere is thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, gangrene, and the stale smoke of charcoal fires. Here, the passage of time is measured only by the rhythmic dripping of water from the ceiling and the distant, rhythmic thud of American naval bombardment that vibrates through the earth like a heavy, vengeful heartbeat. Inside this cavernous shadows, a small group of Japanese nurses, young women drafted from the schools of Okinawa, move like wraiths through the darkness. Their white uniforms, once symbols of purity and sterile discipline, are now tattered rags stained a dull, permanent rust color from weeks of desperate labor. They work in a silence that is almost religious, tending to men who are no longer soldiers but shattered remnants of humanity, huddled on blood-soaked mats. The light is scarce, provided only by flickering oil lamps that cast long, distorted shadows against the jagged cave walls, mirroring the distorted reality of their existence. The sensory world of these women has narrowed to the immediate and the horrific. They feel the heat of a patient's fever through their fingertips, hear the rasping breath of the dying, and smell the pervasive rot that no amount of ventilation can clear. Beyond the cave entrance lies a world they have been told is inhabited by demons. 4 months, the imperial propaganda machine has fueled their endurance with a singular, terrifying vision, that to fall into the hands of the Americans is a fate far worse than the death they see around them every hour. They have been taught that the Allied forces are a subhuman tide of barbarians who know nothing of mercy and find sport in the desecration of the vanquished. As the ground above them groans under the weight of advancing Sherman tanks, the nurses prepare for the end. They carry with them small glass vials of potassium cyanide or hand grenades, intended not for the enemy, but for themselves. In the Japanese Martial Code of 1945, there is no provision for the female captive. There is only the choice between a glorious end and an unthinkable shame. Their hands tremble not from the cold, for the cave is stifling, but from the crushing weight of an ideology that demands their total annihilation. They are the daughters of a dying empire, waiting for the mouth of the cave to brighten with the flash of a flamethrower or the silhouette of their executioners. The silence in the cave suddenly fractures. The heavy, mechanical grinding of tracks stops just outside. There is a pause, a moment of profound, terrifying stillness where even the wounded seem to hold their breath. Then, a voice calls out from the blinding white light of the entrance. It is a voice speaking Japanese, but with a strange melodic cadence, the voice of a Nisei linguist. He does not scream commands, he offers a choice. He speaks of safety, of water, and of a life beyond the limestone walls. For the nurses, this is the most dangerous moment of all, the point where the certainty of the grave meets the impossible, terrifying prospect of survival. They look at one another, their eyes wide and hollow in the lamplight, gripped by the fear that the demons have finally arrived to begin their harvest. To understand the tears shed in the summer of 1945, one must first understand the psychological fortress that had been constructed around the Japanese mind. Since the early 1930s, the Japanese educational system had been transformed into a pipeline for state Shintoism and radical militarism. These nurses, many belonging to the Himuri Student Corps, were not professional soldiers, yet they were bound by the same senjinkan, or code of military conduct issued by War Minister Hideki Tojo. The directive was absolute: do not live to endure the shame of imprisonment. In the eyes of the imperial command, surrender was not a tactical transition. It was a spiritual death that severed the individual from the emperor, their family, and their ancestors. This rigid ideology was reinforced by a campaign of systematic terror regarding the American enemy. Propaganda posters and radio broadcasts depicted Americans as Kichiku Bei, devilish Americans and British, monsters who would revel in the physical torture of women. They were told that capture meant certain rape, followed by public execution or being dragged behind tanks. On Okinawa, the southernmost prefecture of Japan, the civilian population was treated as a disposable shield for the mainland. The government even distributed suicide grenades to schoolgirls, teaching them that the most patriotic act they could perform was to pull the pin when the first American soldier appeared. This historical moment matters because it represented the collision of two irreconcilable realities. On one side was the kaidatsu state, the profound exhaustion and despair of a Japanese people who had sacrificed everything for a war they were now losing. On the other was the relentless, industrial-scale confidence of an America that viewed the individual as something to be salvaged rather than discarded. The nurses in the cave were the front line of this ideological war. They were prepared for a brutal end, convinced that the Americans would arrive with bayonets and fire to validate every terrifying word of the propaganda they had consumed since childhood. By mid-1945, the Japanese military had essentially abandoned its medical units to their fate. Supply lines were severed. There were no bandages, no anesthetics, and no rations. The nurses were forced to perform amputations with hacksaws and dress wounds with unwashed rags, all while starving themselves to give the last scraps of rice to the dying. They existed in a state of hypervigilance, their nervous systems frayed by constant bombardment and the psychological burden of being the chosen witnesses to the Empire's slow, agonizing suicide. Their expectation was a crescendo of violence, a final bloody encounter with the demons that would grant them the mercy of a quick death. Yet, the historical reality of the American advance was governed by a different set of directives. While the fighting was among the most savage in human history, the American medical and logistical infrastructure followed in the wake of the infantry like a tidal wave of order. The GIs were not the disorganized barbarians of the radio broadcasts. They were the representatives of a nation that treated logistics as a science and mercy as a byproduct of abundance. The stage was set for a confrontation that would not destroy the nurses' bodies, but would instead dismantle their entire worldview. The tragedy of Okinawa was not just in the loss of life, but in the terrifying realization that the shame they had been taught to fear was, in fact, the beginning of their salvation. The nurses emerged from the limestone darkness with their heads bowed, flinching as the fierce Pacific sun struck their dilated pupils. They expected the immediate sting of the bayonet or the rough handling of a vengeful victor. Instead, they were met by a sight that defied every lecture they had received in the darkened classrooms of Naha. Standing before them were young American GIs, their faces caked with the orange dust of the island, yet their expressions held a disorienting lack of malice. There was no celebratory cruelty, no ritualistic humiliation. Instead, there was a strange, hurried efficiency that treated the nurses not as conquered enemies, but as urgent medical problems. One young nurse, her fingers still clutching a suicide grenade hidden in her sash, watched as a tall American soldier approached. He did not reach for his sidearm. Instead, he reached into a pocket of his grease-stained fatigues and pulled out a small, rectangular brick wrapped in silver foil. He tore it open with his teeth and held it out. It was chocolate, dark, rich, and smelling of a world that had not known starvation. The nurse stared at the offering, her mind reeling. She had been told these men would feast on the suffering of the Japanese. She had not been told they would share their luxury. The soldier simply nodded, a gesture of casual, human recognition that felt more explosive than the shells that had rocked the cave. The emotional contrast was a physical blow. To the Japanese staff, every resource was a precious, dwindling commodity to be hoarded or sacrificed. To the Americans, resources seemed to flow like water. Within minutes of their surrender, the nurses witnessed the arrival of a water buffalo, a massive tank on wheels, dispensing gallons of clean, cool water. They saw soldiers casually lighting cigarettes and tossing the half-finished stubs aside, an act of wastefulness that was unthinkable to a people who had been recycling bandages for months. The Americans moved with a confidence that was not born of cruelty, but of a staggering, effortless abundance. The nurses were ushered toward a fleet of waiting trucks. As they climbed aboard, they were handed heavy, wool blankets, thick, warm, and smelling of laundry soap. One nurse began to tremble, her hands stroking the coarse fabric. She had prepared herself for the coldness of a shallow grave. She was entirely unprepared for the warmth of American wool. The propaganda had promised a descent into a hell of subhuman brutality, but the reality was a jarring transition into a world of logistical miracles. They looked at the soldiers, who were laughing and shouting to one another, oblivious to the fact that they were dismantling a decade of indoctrination with every casual act of provision. As the trucks jolted forward, moving away from the stench of the caves and toward the American lines, the nurses remained in a state of shock. They were alive, they were fed, and they were being transported in vehicles that functioned with a mechanical perfection they hadn't seen in years. The terrifying demons of their imagination were being replaced by the reality of the American GI, men who were more interested in the state of their canteens than in the execution of their prisoners. This first encounter was the beginning of a profound disorientation, a cracks in the armor of their loyalty that would soon widen into an emotional flood. The truck convoy rolled through the flattened remains of Okinawan villages, arriving at a sprawling encampment that looked less like a temporary military position and more like a prefabricated city. This was the American rear echelon, a logistical marvel where the industrial might of the United States was on full display. For the nurses, the sight was surreal. In the Japanese army, the rear was often just a slightly less dangerous version of the front, plagued by the same shortages and filth. Here, however, were row upon row of olive-drab tents, perfectly aligned, illuminated by portable electric generators that hummed with a steady, defiant power. They were brought to a massive field hospital, a structure composed of interconnected canvas wards and plywood floors. The sheer scale of the medical enterprise was staggering. Factual records of the era note that a single American field hospital on Okinawa possessed more surgical equipment and life-saving drugs than entire Japanese divisions. The nurses saw stacks of crates reaching toward the sky, filled with sulfa powder, morphine, and the miracle of penicillin, medicine that, in their world, was reserved only for high-ranking officers or the most elite units. Here, it was being used in such volume that it seemed as common as the dirt beneath their feet. The environment was a sensory overload of efficiency. The air did not smell of rot. It smelled of Lysol, laundry starch, and the sweet, heavy scent of pipe tobacco. They watched as American orderlies moved with a brisk, unhurried pace, their uniforms clean and their boots polished. To the nurses, who had spent years hearing that the Americans were a chaotic and undisciplined mob, the sight of such organized high-tech care was a devastating blow to their core beliefs. The American machine did not just win battles with bullets. It won them with refrigerators full of blood plasma and a supply chain that stretched across the entire Pacific. One nurse observed an American medic treating a wounded Japanese prisoner with the same meticulous care he gave to his own countrymen. She watched as he carefully cleaned a shrapnel wound, applied a sterile dressing, and administered an injection of morphine to dull the man's agony. This was the greatest contradiction of all. In the imperial doctrine, a wounded soldier who could no longer fight was often seen as a burden, someone encouraged to take their own life to save rations. In the American ward, the value of a human life was seemingly detached from its utility in combat. As they were processed through the intake station, the nurses were given something they had not possessed in years, a sense of order. They were registered, bathed in warm water, and provided with fresh, clean clothing. The frantic, desperate edge of their existence began to dull, replaced by a profound, hollow shock. They were in the heart of the enemy's power, yet for the first time since the war began, they were safe. The American logistical machine was not just a tool of war. It was a physical manifestation of a society that could afford to be merciful because its abundance was absolute. This realization, more than the threat of violence, began to erode the foundations of their loyalty to the falling empire. In the center of the intake tent sat a heavy wooden crate, and upon it, an American cook placed the object that would become the focal point of their psychological unraveling, a polished silver mess tin. It was a simple piece of stamped aluminum, yet in the harsh glare of the electric lights, it gleamed with a terrifying, impossible luster. For the nurses, who had spent months eating meager portions of grit-filled barley out of rusted cans, the cleanliness of the tin was a shock. But it was the contents that truly paralyzed them. The tin was filled to the brim with steaming white rice, not the gray, infested grains they were used to, but pure, pearlescent kernels. Resting atop the rice were thick slices of Spam and a generous portion of canned peaches, their golden syrup pooling into the grains. The peaches were the most surreal element of all. In the height of the Pacific War, fruit had become a distant memory for the Japanese garrison, a luxury reserved for the gods or the emperor himself. To see it served casually to prisoners in a silver tin was a subversion of their entire reality. One of the nurses, a young woman named Hanako, stared at the peach slice, her reflection shimmering in the syrup. She had been taught that Americans were a primitive race of scavengers who would starve their captives. Yet, here was a bounty that exceeded the finest meals she had ever seen in peacetime. The silver mess tin became a recurring symbol of a system that did not just survive, but thrived in the midst of total war. The act of eating became a ritual of silent, communal disbelief. The nurses picked up the heavy American spoons, feeling the weight of the metal in their hands, another sign of a nation that had so much steel it could turn it into cutlery for the vanquished. As they tasted the sugar of the peaches and the salt of the meat, the physical sensation triggered a violent reaction in their malnourished bodies. This was the American abundance, a concept they had heard dismissed as decadent weakness in imperial radio broadcasts. They realized then that the strength of their enemy was not merely in their tanks or planes, but in this silver tin, in the ability to provide luxury where the empire could not even provide water. The symbolism of the meal extended beyond the calories. It represented a democracy of resources. The soldiers standing nearby were eating the exact same meal from the exact same silver tins. In the Japanese military, the chasm between the officer's plate and the soldier's bowl was a fundamental law of nature. Here, the nurses observed a strange, egalitarian distribution of wealth. The silver mess tin, overflowing and effortless, suggested a world where the struggle for basic survival had been solved, leaving the Americans free to focus on the technical execution of victory. As they finished the meal, scraping the bottom of the tins, the nurses remained huddled together. The terror of the cave was fading, replaced by a much more complex and unsettling emotion. They were no longer afraid of being killed. They were beginning to be afraid of the truth. If the Americans were not the monsters they had been promised, then the thousands of lives sacrificed on the altar of imperial propaganda had been lost for a lie. The silver mess tin, now empty but still shining, stood as a silent metallic witness to the collapse of their world. It was the first tangible proof that the American demons possessed a weapon more powerful than any bomb, the ability to treat an enemy like a human being. After the meal, the nurses were not interrogated or marched into a stockade. Instead, they were led to a quiet sector of the camp where several large canvas tents had been designated as sleeping quarters. An American officer, through an interpreter, delivered an order that seemed more incomprehensible than any threat. They were to sleep. For the women of the Himuri, the concept of unearned rest was a foreign, almost suspicious prospect. In the imperial system, a body was a tool for the state, and to rest while the nation suffered was a form of desertion. Their existence had been a marathon of sleep deprivation, fueled by amphetamines and the adrenaline of terror, where a few minutes of leaning against a cave wall was the only respite allowed. As they entered the tents, they found rows of military cots. Each cot was covered with a taut, clean canvas and topped with a pillow, a luxury they had not seen since the peace of 1941. The nurses stood motionless in the aisle, looking at the beds with a mixture of longing and profound mistrust. They were waiting for the trick, the sudden shift where the kindness would vanish and the promised brutality would begin. They whispered among themselves, wondering if this was a preparatory phase for a more elaborate execution. The psychological toll of the war had left them unable to process the idea of care that lacked a hidden, violent cost. However, the American sentries outside the tent did not enter. They sat on crates, cleaning their equipment and smoking, their silhouettes visible against the canvas as the tropical sun began to set. The sounds of the camp, the low rumble of generators, the distant clatter of the mess hall, and the rhythmic sound of a GI whistling a jazz tune, created a strange, peaceful soundscape. One by one, the nurses began to sit on the edge of the cots. The sensation of the fabric yielding beneath their weight was a physical shock. For months, they had known only the unyielding limestone of the caves or the jagged coral of the trenches. The suspension of their hypervigilance was painful. As their bodies began to recognize the safety of the environment, the accumulated fatigue of 3 months of constant combat began to crash over them like a wave. The suspicion remained, but it was being drowned by the sheer, biological necessity of sleep. They lay down tentatively, still wearing their clean, oversized American-issued fatigues, their hands instinctively clutching the blankets. They were waiting for a sergeant to scream at them, for a shell to impact, or for the demons to finally show their true faces. But the screams never came. Instead, the camp grew quieter as the night deepened. The American military machine, so loud and destructive during the day, moved into a resting phase that was just as disciplined. The nurses realized that for the first time in years, they were not responsible for the lives of others, and no one was demanding their deaths. The burden of being the Empire's sacrificial daughters was being lifted, not by a grand gesture, but by the simple, democratic gift of time. In the silence of the tent, the ticking of a soldier's watch nearby was the only sound, marking the seconds of a life they had never expected to have. This quietude was a weapon of its own, forcing them to confront the vacuum left behind by their dying ideology. As they finally drifted into a deep, heavy slumber, the fortress of their indoctrination began to crumble in the dark. When the nurses woke, the sun was high, and the camp was already alive with the hum of industrial morning. It was then, in the sober clarity of daylight, that the realization of their survival finally breached the final defenses of their psyche. They were gathered outside the tents for a medical inspection, standing in a line that would have once been a formation of rigid military precision. But there was no officer to scream at them, no superior to demand they hide their exhaustion for the glory of the Emperor. There was only an American doctor and a few orderlies who moved down the line with stethoscopes and thermometers, treating them with a clinical, dispassionate kindness that was more jarring than any blow. The breaking point arrived not through a single event, but through the cumulative weight of the previous 24 hours. They looked at their hands, now clean and devoid of the dried blood of their countrymen. They looked at the silver mess tins being filled once again with hot food, this time oatmeal with sugar and more of the miraculous tinned fruit. The recurring symbol of American abundance was everywhere, in the stacks of crates, the idling trucks, and the casual way a soldier tossed a fresh orange to his friend. It was the realization that the demons had not only spared their lives, but were actively investing resources to preserve them. The weeping began with one of the youngest students, a girl who had been convinced she would be dead by her 17th birthday. It was not a quiet sob, but a deep, racking convulsion of the soul. Soon, it spread through the group like a physical contagion. They wept for the brothers and fathers they had watched die in the mud, convinced that the Americans would never take prisoners. They wept for the months they had spent starving in the dark, clutching suicide grenades while the enemy they feared was preparing to offer them medicine and rest. Most of all, they wept for the betrayal of the lie, the realization that their own government had demanded their deaths to hide the truth of the enemy's humanity. The emotional contrast was total. In the Japanese worldview, the surrender was the end of all things. In the American camp, it was treated as the beginning of a recovery process. The American doctor paused, looking at the crying women with a mixture of confusion and pity. He did not understand the years of indoctrination that were being washed away by those tears. To him, they were simply patients suffering from acute stress and malnutrition. To the nurses, every breath they took in the fresh air of the camp was a victory over the darkness that had consumed their youth. This was the moment of their true transformation. The tears were a purge, a shedding of the imperial identity that had defined their lives since childhood. They realized that the shame of capture was a myth designed to keep them in the caves. The reality was the silver tin, the clean cot, and the terrifying, beautiful realization that they were free to live. As they sat on the grass, their faces wet with tears and the tropical sun warming their backs, the nurses began to let go of the empire. They were no longer sacrificial symbols. They were human beings again, rediscovering the value of their own lives in the shadow of the American machine. The transition from captives to participants began when the American doctors, recognizing the nurses' professional backgrounds, offered them the chance to assist in the wards. It was a request, not a command, yet it felt like a lifeline to a group of women who had defined their entire existence through service. Stepping back into a medical environment, however, provided a final, crushing blow to their previous ideology. They found themselves working within a system where the democratic application of medicine was absolute. In the American wards, the triage was based on the severity of the wound, not the rank of the soldier or the color of his uniform. The nurses watched in stunned silence as a Japanese private, suffering from a traumatic chest wound, was rushed into surgery ahead of an American lieutenant with a broken leg. To the nurses, this was a subversion of the natural order they had known under the Imperial Japanese Army. In their world, medical supplies were prioritized for those who could still return to the front. Those beyond repair were often given a grenade and a final salute. Here, the American medical machine labored with equal intensity over every broken body. They witnessed the arrival of C-47 transport planes, converted into flying ambulances, which evacuated the most critically wounded to hospital ships anchored offshore. The sheer industrial scale of this compassion was a physical presence. They saw the GIs handling the wounded Japanese with a professional detachment that was devoid of the hatred they had been promised. The nurses were given roles as assistants, cleaning wounds and administering basic care. As they worked, they were constantly exposed to the recurring symbol of American logistics, the abundance of sterile supplies. They handled rolls of surgical gauze that were white as fresh snow, unlike the gray, boiled rags they had reused a dozen times in the caves. They saw bins overflowing with discarded bandages, a level of waste that suggested an infinite reservoir of resources. This material wealth was not just a military advantage, it was a moral one. It allowed the Americans to be merciful. When a nurse reached for a fresh roll of tape or a new bottle of antiseptic, she was interacting with the physical manifestation of a society that valued the preservation of life over the glory of death. Perhaps most transformative was the lack of hierarchy in the daily interactions. The American nurses and medics joked with one another, showing a casual confidence that stood in contrast to the rigid, fear-based discipline of the Japanese military. The Japanese nurses were treated as colleagues, their expertise respected by men they had been told would view them as subhuman. This integration into the American medical effort allowed them to see the war from the other side, not as a desperate struggle for survival, but as a technical problem being solved by a nation with a surplus of everything, including empathy. By the end of their first week in the wards, the internal transformation of the nurses was nearly complete. They no longer flinched when an American GI spoke to them. They no longer looked for a place to hide their suicide grenades. Instead, they focused on the work at hand, their hands moving with a newfound steadiness. They were contributing to a system that sought to heal the very men their own leaders had told them to kill. The realization that they were part of a more humane and effective way of living was a quiet, steady revelation. The American abundance had provided the medicine, but the democratic spirit of the ward provided the cure for their indoctrination. They were learning that a nation's true strength was not measured by how many of its children were willing to die, but by how many it was willing to save. As the final pockets of resistance on Okinawa were systematically eliminated, the nurses watched the complete collapse of the death before dishonor myth from a vantage point of safety and observation. This was the ideological climax of their journey. For their entire lives, they had been told that the Japanese spirit, or Yamato Damashii, was a force that could overcome any material disadvantage. They had been taught that the Americans were a soft, soulless people whose reliance on machines made them weak in the face of spiritual purity. Yet, as they stood within the American perimeter, they saw the opposite, a casual, unshakable confidence that was born not from desperation, but from the certainty of their system's success. The contrast in the behavior of the soldiers was the most damning evidence. The Japanese officers they had served under were often brutal to their subordinates, maintaining a rigid hierarchy through physical punishment and the constant threat of shame. In the American camp, the nurses observed a shocking degree of personal freedom. They saw GIs arguing with their sergeants, laughing loudly over card games, and spending their leisure time reading paperbacks or writing letters home to a land that was not being bombed into dust. This was the decadent freedom the propaganda had mocked, but to the nurses, it looked like a terrifying form of strength. The Americans did not need to be coerced into fighting. They fought because they believed in the machine they were a part of. The nurses began to realize that the imperial cult of suicide was not a sign of strength, but an admission of failure. The demand for gyokusai, the shattered jewel, or mass suicide, was the only answer a starving, broken command could offer. The Americans, by contrast, had an answer for everything. If they needed a road, they built it in a day with massive yellow bulldozers. If they needed blood, it arrived in refrigerated crates. If they needed morale, they provided hot coffee, jazz music, and the gift of rest. The nurses saw that the Americans did not view death as a glorious end, but as a logistical failure to be avoided at all costs. This fundamental shift in the value of human life was the final blow to their loyalty. In the wards, they assisted in the treatment of more captured Japanese soldiers who arrived in states of near total physical and mental collapse. These men, like the nurses before them, arrived expecting the bayonet, only to be met with the silver mess tin and the stethoscope. The nurses now became the bridge between these two worlds. They whispered to their countrymen, telling them it was safe to eat, safe to sleep, and safe to live. They were no longer victims of the propaganda. They were the antidote to it. They watched as the terror in the eyes of the dying soldiers was replaced by a bewildered peace, the same peace they had found when they first tasted the canned peaches in the sun. The myth of the American demon had been utterly dismantled. In its place stood a complex, industrial democracy that was far more powerful than any spirit of sacrifice. The nurses realized that the empire had asked for their lives because it had nothing else to give. The Americans gave them life because they had everything to spare. This ideological collapse was not a moment of shame, but one of profound liberation. They had been released from a death cult and returned to the world of the living. As they looked out over the bustling camp, they understood that the war was not just being won on the battlefield, but in the hearts of those who had been taught to hate, only to be conquered by the overwhelming reality of kindness and abundance. August 1945. The guns have finally fallen silent across the ridges of Okinawa, leaving behind a landscape that is more scar than island. The air no longer vibrates with the scream of kamikaze planes or the thunder of naval salvos. Instead, there is only the rhythmic, peaceful lapping of the Pacific against the hulls of 1,000 Allied ships. In the American encampments, The frantic energy of combat has shifted into the steady, measured pace of occupation. The nurses, once the desperate daughters of a doomed empire, now stand on the threshold of a world they were never meant to see, a world defined not by the shadow of the sword, but by the light of a new and uncertain peace. The experience of these women stands as a profound testament to the power of human contact in the wake of total war. They had entered the summer convinced that their identity was inextricably linked to their willingness to die. They emerged from it realizing that their value was inherent in their ability to live, to heal, and to hope. The silver mess tin, which had first appeared to them as a jarring symbol of enemy decadence, had become a mundane reality of their daily lives. It represented the transition from a society of scarcity and ritual suicide to one of abundance and individual worth. The peaches, the white rice, and the clean wool blankets were more than just logistical comforts. They were the physical tools that dismantled a decade of state-sponsored terror. This transformation highlights a larger truth about the nature of freedom and the collapse of totalitarian ideology. The Japanese nurses did not weep because they were defeated. They wept because they were seen. They wept because the American demons had offered them the one thing their own leaders could not, the gift of time. By allowing them to recover, both physically and mentally, the American medical machine had performed a surgery on their souls, removing the cancer of indoctrination and replacing it with the simple, democratic truth that life is a precious commodity. The abundance of the United States was not just in its steel and oil, but in its capacity to treat the conquered as human beings worthy of a future. As the sun sets over the East China Sea, casting long golden fingers across the bustling airfield, the nurses prepare for the journey back to a Japan that is being reborn. They carry with them more than just the memories of the caves. They carry the knowledge that the darkness they lived through was a choice made by men, not a law of nature. The tears they shed on Okinawa were the first rains of a new season for their nation, a season where the shame of survival would be replaced by the responsibility of rebuilding. In the silence of the evening, the distant hum of an American generator is no longer a sound of war, but a heartbeat of a new era. The story of the Okinawan nurses remains a poetic reflection on the resilience of the human spirit when met with unexpected grace. It serves as a reminder that even in the most savage of conflicts, the most effective weapon against hatred is the undeniable reality of kindness. Abundance, when shared with the vanquished, becomes a bridge. Mercy, when offered to the enemy, becomes a liberation. They had been prepared to be the last flowers of a dying empire, but through the simple provision of food, medicine, and rest, they became the first seeds of a free and peaceful Japan. The war did not end with their deaths, it ended with their recovery, proving that the ultimate victory is not found in the destruction of an enemy, but in the restoration of a human being.